Om Partaya Pratibodhitam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Gratitam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaitamrita Varshinim Bhagavati Mashtadashadhyayinim Ambatvam Anusandhadhami Bhagavad Gita Pavadveshinim. Om. O Bhagavad Gita, with which Bharata Arjuna was enlightened by the Lord Narayana, in which was incorporated in the Mahabharata by the ancient Muni Vyasa, the Divine Mother, the destroyer of rebirth, the one who showers the nectar of Advaita, and consisting of 18 chapters. Upon thee, O Bhagavad Gita, O affectionate mother, I offer my salutations. You know, for spiritual seekers, the most daunting task that we have in our quest is to try to deal with that which is closest to us. Because that which is closest to us is very hard to objectify. And what is closest to us? It's our own self. That's what's closest to us. I feel that Sri Krishna's perspective on the subject of self is one of the major themes of the Bhagavad Gita. What could possibly be more important to us, more central to our life than our own self? So this evening, let's consider Sri Krishna's approach to this issue of self. And we're introduced to it at the very beginning of the Gita, when Arjuna and Sri Krishna are entering into a dialogue. And this is just before the Kurukshetra war. I'm sure you are all familiar, at least to some extent, with the Mahabharata. So the two families, the Kauravas, the Pandavas, could not, by diplomatic means, resolve their differences for the throne in Hastinapura. So they were about to enter a war. Now, the Kauravas had the largest army by far. But the Pandavas had Sri Krishna as their leader and Arjuna's charioteer, which was a decided advantage. Now, before the war began, Arjuna asked Sri Krishna, "Drive the chariot between the two armies so that I can see who wants to fight with me." Now, this is very interesting. From the very beginning of the Gita, we begin to see Arjuna's doubt. We begin to see his nervousness when he asked, right before the battle, drive this chariot between the two armies. Arjuna knew very well who he was fighting. There was no doubt in his mind. But he asked the Lord to do this. Now let us consider this sort of as an allegory for our life, what happens to us psychologically in many situations. Knowingly, Arjuna stands at the edge of the battlefield and he looks out. Now just imagine his feeling. What is he seeing? On the other side of the battlefield, arrayed before him, were all of his family members. His beloved and honored grandfather, Bhishma. He sees Dronacharya, the master of archery, fathers, grandfathers, uncles, cousins, all of them he's facing. What happens to Arjuna when he sees this? He forgets himself completely. He starts to perspire, his head starts to reel, he sees adverse omens everywhere, and he's about to faint in a major meltdown. And at that point, if you picture the scene, his mighty bow, Gandiva, is thrown onto the chariot floor and he collapses. Then he proceeds to tell Krishna all the reasons why, rationalize all the reasons why he cannot do his duty as a kshatriya, one by one, in very high-sounding, well-reasoned arguments. In the first chapter of the Gita, Arjuna have impeccable arguments of why he should not go to battle. You couldn't argue with him, really. He has wonderful reasons why he should not. But Sri Krishna sees through Arjuna's mask. And he sees that Arjuna's being a coward. So instead of consoling him, he scolds him. And he says, "Stand up, O Partha." This mean-heartedness, this faintness of heart does not befit thee. You're a great warrior. Stand up, O scorcher of foes. Now, imagine Arjuna's psychological condition. This is the reception he got. He thought he was going to be praised for his well-reasoned arguments, his dharmic approach, etc. And Sri Krishna actually scolds him. You see, at that point, Arjuna not only forgot his duty as a kshatriya, forgetting his worldly duty, what to speak of forgetting his real spiritual self. So this was the situation. He basically said, "I will not fight. I refuse to fight," even though Krishna told him to stand up. So we're going to look at this dilemma, this ultimate dilemma that Krishna had to face with Arjuna in this condition. His problem, his dilemma, and Sri Krishna's resolution. The basic problem here is that Arjuna was overcome by depression. He was overcome by grief because of his misidentification. He was not aware of his higher self. This is the whole issue in spiritual life, is we're trying to become aware of the spiritual dimension of our being. This is the message of the Gita, one of the messages of the Gita. And we should keep in mind that the Gita is a yoga shastra. You know, each chapter, each colophon of the Bhagavad Gita ends with Iti Shrimad Bhagavad Gita Su Upanishad Su Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastre Shri Krishna Arjuna Sambade, etc. Every chapter, 18 chapters, ends with this colophon. So it's telling us that the Bhagavad Gita is the scripture for the highest knowledge, Brahma Vidya. It's a yoga shastra. What is a yoga shastra? A yoga shastra is a practical means for us to approach and reunite with ourself, our real self. That's one of the main meanings of yoga. So we want to transmute this small self into the universal self. So this evening what I'd like to do is to start with, I would like to give some very common sense, down-to-earth perspectives from the Vedantic point of view about the nature of self. You know, we can speak philosophy, we can read all of the commentaries, we can write papers about them, we can write books, but we need to be able to incorporate these ideas in our life. The Gita is very practical, and this is the main point of a yoga shastra, and it should be remembered. The Gita is a gospel, practically a blueprint for our life. So we have to make the concepts, the ideas, the teachings of Sri Krishna real for us, where we are in our life. We can speculate, we can talk about the highest philosophy and so on. It's wonderful. It has its place. But if we can't take these concepts and interpret them in our life and make them life-changing, what good are they? They just remain as mental concepts. So let's take a look at this. Now, Vedanta is very practical. So we start with the analysis of the self as a particular individual. Myself. We don't need to have any proof. We experience ourselves every day of our lives. We know that we exist. We know that we are self-conscious beings. Nobody can convince us that we're not. That's a very basic. We know that we exist. Now, say Homeland Security comes and they say, "Who are you?" And you say, "Well, I'm Jane Smith, and I live in New York, and I work in the financial district." And they may ask for a photo ID. This is very funny. I think it's very funny that we have to have a real ID by October 2020. What we really need right now is an unreal ID. But we're trying to get a real one. So they're going to ask us for our ID, an unreal ID, that will have our photo and maybe some biodata, an iris scan, some kind of DNA information, etc. And they're going to prove physically that this is who we are. And when they verify that our physical description meets their criterion, they're satisfied this is who we are. So that's one of our identities. And then say you go down to downtown and you're going for a job interview. What do they ask you for? They want your biodata. Okay, so your biodata will give all of your educational requirements and specifications that are needed for a specific skill set for a job. And when that prospective employer is satisfied with your biodata, he accepts that's who you are. Then we have so many relationships in our lives. We may be a husband or a wife or a mother or brother or sister, cousin, friend. We have so many activities, so many hobbies, so many talents. I love to play the guitar. I'm an excellent singer in the choir. I'm a scientist. So the point is, we have all of these identities in our life. And sometimes these identities collide. And if we're thoughtful, we start to question, is this all that I am? Or is there something more? Is there something else here besides these identities that I normally associate with? So that question comes. We're all a bundle of all of these physical, mental, and emotional identities. Now, as I mentioned, this was Arjuna's conflict in the very beginning. Like Arjuna, we also are confronted with this identity crisis, this confusion. This is why we come to spiritual life, because we're looking for a different identity. And if we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit that we don't really know who we are. And one of the reasons we don't know is that our identity is constantly changing through all of these various examples that I've given. And so we move through one identity to the other without any kind of central stabilizing factor in our life. And that's not a very secure situation. And on top of that, we're mortal. So it's not just the medicine in our medicine cabinets that have an expiration date. We also have an expiration date. It may not be stamped on our forehead, or it may, if you believe in kismet, karma, fate. But nevertheless, we're perishable. If we identify with all of these changing conditions, we then take this psychophysical organism, this Jane Smith, to be who we are. And if we leave it unexamined, that's who we think we are. But for spiritual seekers, we don't want to leave it like that. We want to examine it. and to examine it, to really examine our individuality and our self, to come to this true self-awareness, takes a lot of courage, mostly a lot of patience. It's bold. We have to be bold to be able to face the fact and question things. So one of the things I feel that our sense of identity, although we don't really understand it, we know that we have a continued sense of identity even when the body goes. We know that. We know the metaphysical, philosophical explanation for that given by Vedanta. I won't go into that here. We can discuss it later if you'd like to discuss it. But the point is that when the physical body goes, our self doesn't go. I'm talking about our relative self. So our subtle body, this linga sharira, which constitutes all of the mental tendencies and so on, and the various subtle koshas, that is what transmigrates from body to body. So even though in one life we may not come to that realization, we carry these samskaras from life to life. And eventually the thought is, especially in Eastern religions, that eventually we will come out of this samsara into enlightenment. So what does that take? One thing that it takes is, at some point we have to pause and think, how am I going to get out of this? I mean, we're being spun round and round like the spin cycle on a wash machine, life after life after life. We go through the same experiences, and we have the same sufferings, the same joys, same happiness, but even the joys and the happiness and the satisfaction that we get from relationships or from our job satisfaction, or whatever it is, ultimately, not to sound negative, but it's painful. Why is it painful? Because there will eventually be a separation. We can't hold on to it. It's not part of us. So eventually we become separated from those things. And when we become separated from anyone that we love or a job or any of these things that we identify with in this bundle, there's a painful reaction comes in the mind. Lord Buddha spoke extensively about this. Samsara is dukkha. It's not negative, it's a fact. So in Vedanta, I know I understand that Swamiji is studying the Mandukya Upanishad. And probably with Gaudapada's Karika, it's a very tough text. But it's actually the Karikas, in a way, easier to understand than the actual 12 verses of the Upanishad, the commentary, because it's actually very practical. So let's look at what that Upanishad says in very simple language. So if you take your I, as you identify now, in the waking state, we know our experience. We, at this point in our state of evolution, we experience the external world, we experience our relationships with everyone, because this is where our level of perception is. When we go to sleep, what happens? When we go to sleep, that I that we identify in this waking state is gone. The external world is gone. And if we're dreaming, another identification rises, the dream ego. When we're dreaming, we have a whole other set of props, a whole stage, a whole different set of characters. And we're living in that, and it's real. According to Vedanta, pratibhasika satya, it's real. For that moment, it is real. Bottom line is everything is real. It depends on which level of reality we're talking about. There's no unreality. Actually, there's no asat as such, because everything is real. How long is that real? This is the thing. A dream, it seems eternally real. Anything can happen in a dream. We can become the Queen of England, we're this or that, we travel around the world, we go to the moon. Seems perfectly logical at the time. when we come out of that dream state and we go into the deep sleep state, what happens? That identity's gone. We're not on the moon anymore. We're not sitting in the Vedanta society. We're not aware of anything if we're in deep sleep. We come out of deep sleep and we say, oh, I slept great. I wasn't aware of anything. Now, where from can we say, I'm not aware of anything when we weren't there to experience it? So see, every day we're getting hints that we are something other than what we are, but we don't pay any attention to it. And our spiritual masters, especially in the Upanishads and other places, they're saying, look at these daily experiences that you have. There's no permanent experience anywhere in your egocentric life. And furthermore, if this waking state, if it was the only reality, if this was the truth, then when we go to sleep, or when we're in deep sleep, we should still be aware of everything that we're aware of right this minute, everything around us, the external world, etc. That's not what happens. What happens to everything? What happens to the world and the people and everything around us? If it was truly real in the final state of existence and consciousness, we would be aware of everything in all states as we are in this waking state. We give a lot of importance to this waking state. The spiritual masters say if you can touch the spiritual dimension of your being, you will see that your self-identity shifts. This waking state will appear as much of a dream as when you're in a dream state. And you will be aware of a much more profound reality that never changes, a permanent existence. Now, this is pretty profound. We don't need to go to philosophy books or, break our heads over metaphysics to understand this. I like to think of these things in very simple terms because it's part of our experience. We don't have to, it's very helpful. I'm not decrying philosophy. It's very important to study, and it's very important to have intellectual understanding. Why? Number one, it gives us clear concepts, mental concepts. It removes doubts and superstitions and fears. These things, they have their place. But to me, what's more important is, how does it affect my life? How can I apply it to my life? So this is one way we can apply it. When we think of it in this way, then we realize, no, this is not the final. This is not final. There's another state of existence. Now, our teachers say, including Sri Krishna, that how we perceive things depends upon our evolution. It depends on our level of consciousness. So take an example. Say you get into one of these buildings here in New York, and it's got 54 floors, probably has 250 floors. You get on the elevator, and as you're going up the elevator to different floors, you're going to see different things at different levels of the elevator. If it has windows, you're going to see different areas of the city. And when you get to the top, you have this vast panorama. So if you think of that kind of like with the chakras, or the levels of consciousness of an individual, as our consciousness lifts, so to speak, we begin to perceive another level of reality. Now, Swami Vivekananda talks about this at length in Jnana Yoga. He said, right now you have your organs of perception, and you have one perception of reality. Swamiji says if you develop a sixth sense, you're going to perceive a whole other different level. Now, even modern science is coming to this. They don't put it in these terms. I mean, quantum theory is an example. So how can you have two molecules that are separated by a great distance and something happens to one and simultaneously it happens to the other? I mean, we live in a multiverse, even scientifically. People's minds are expanding in that way. So So at this point, we're living in kind of a closed down cocoon of existence. And this is what happened to Arjuna. And it's given in this kind of very practical way, and Sri Krishna is trying to, from the moment that he tells him to stand up and fight, he's basically saying, stand up and realize your own self, who you are. And the rest of the Gita is basically an elaboration of this idea that comes in the first and second chapters. So this is what we're trying to explore, is this relative self and how we can lift out of this self and expand ourselves. This is what we're trying to see. Now, when we think of our own state of existence, we can't really imagine being non-existent. None of us can. Can you imagine your own non-existence? You can't. Why? Because there's a small divine spark there that's immortal. And that was covered for Arjuna, and it's covered for most of us. But it's there. And that's one of the things that confused Arjuna. The very fact that we are this immortal being is what prods us to seek permanence in the impermanent in the first place, because we're confused. So we're not really to be blamed. It's kind of a disclaimer. If I'm immortal, I can't imagine my non-existence, then why wouldn't I seek permanence outside? It's kind of, inverse, reverse logic, but it's true. And this is, I think, what was driving Arjuna, unknowingly. Because at the moment, he became overwhelmed with delusion. He couldn't sort things out. So Sri Krishna, step by step by step, starts to sort things out for him and turn his attention inward. Sri Ramakrishna used to give an example in the gospel. He gives an example. I think it's a great example. It's very simple. And he says, consciousness is one. The biggest problem for all of us is this misidentification, this ego, this limited self-awareness. He said it's something like, say you throw a stick in a body of water. Well, that stick appears to separate the water. There's some water on the right of the stick and some on the left. When you remove that stick, the water becomes one. That's how Sri Ramakrishna puts it. So if we think in those terms of ourself, it is this misidentification, our misidentification, that's the cause of the bifurcation of consciousness as we perceive it. Nothing's happened to consciousness. There is only one being, and all of the spiritual teachers, the great masters, are in accord with this. There's not two selves, my relative self and my spiritual self. It's a matter of perception. That Swami Vivekananda gave in Jnana Yoga, gave a wonderful talk, open your eyes and see him. Swamiji doesn't say you have to do this and you have to do this and that and this and this and you're going to go to heaven, you're going to find this reality somewhere. It's here. It's right now. We're not aware of it. It's a matter of perception. So naturally the question comes, this is the tricky part, because our relative self is not actually separate from our spiritual self. So how do we manage that? How do we make that leap, so to speak, from our relative self to our spiritual self? And why is it that it appears this way? Why does it happen like this? Of course, this is the age-old question, why Maya? And Swamiji says Hindus are very honest. They'll simply say, we don't know. You can't explain it. But when you come out of that state, of that ignorant state, then you see it never really existed in the way that you thought it was. So it's kind of like a Zen koan. You know, the Zen masters would give koans to their disciples. And they would say, listen to the sound of one hand clapping. One hand clapping? Well, there isn't such a thing as one hand clapping. So the point that the Zen masters were doing is that they're trying to push our minds out of the ordinary ratiocinations that we do and push it beyond into an intuitive level of perception, beyond our four-square thinking. This takes practice, of course. Now, one explanation why this is so, if we want to call it an explanation, this appearance, is that, and bear with me, our I consciousness is just a mental concept. Okay? Our identification is a mental concept. It's a mental construct. Again, Sri Ramakrishna in the Gospel puts it very simply. He says, take an onion, and you go on peeling the onion. You know, you take all the layers out. All the ladies that cook here know this. You take all the layers out, and there's nothing in the center. He said the ego is similar to that. It doesn't have any real existence. And when we pursue it in that way, we see that it's very flimsy. But, and this is the big conundrum, we don't know where we were before we were born. We don't know how we got here. But at some point, we recognized that we had an individual existence, isn't it? This is how my mind works. I think at some point, I became aware that I was a distinct individual. And that's the death knell. And we've been indoctrinated since our birth to consider ourselves as separate from everything in the universe. Yes, on one level, but from a scientific level, all molecules of matter are interchangeable. And the mind is universal. But practically speaking, my lump of matter in the form of this body separates me from you. And my mind vibrates separately from you. So therein, this sense of duality enters. I'm distinct because we identify with it. That's the point. That's our perception. So if we identify with this sort of changing condition, all of the duality enters after that. And that's how this individualization becomes a concrete fact for us. But if we step back and through our sadhana, we will see that we're just a person passing through. We don't have a permanent visa here. We only have a temporary visa. And we don't know how long that visa is going to be valid. We're simply passing through. But unfortunately, because of all the reasons given, we take it to be solid. And we take it to be real. And that conditions our thinking and everything that goes with it. So now the question comes, well, how to get out of this? I mean, life after life, as I said, we go through this. We go through the same experiences. And if that's not enough, we try to find novel experiences, and we go on adding to our baggage, and there's no limit to the carry-on baggage, so we go on and on and on for the next life. We go on adding all of these mental tendencies and so on. But sooner or later, for seekers of truth like all of us, spiritual seekers, we pause, and maybe something happens in our life, or just through natural evolution, and we open our eyes and just, as I said, with even analyzing what happens daily when we fall asleep. If we simply sit on a bench in downtown New York and observe what's going on, Just watch how the world is going on. Then we began to get sort of a sense that there's no stability here. Everything, no matter how wonderful, eventually it corrodes, it falls apart. You know, the Mundaka Upanishad says, whatever is made of parts falls apart. And you who dwell in New York City had a very horrible demonstration of that in 9/11. You don't know what's a very dangerous world that we live in, and it's a very temporary world, although it seems very solid. So thoughtful people, spiritual seekers, start to really question these things. And they want to know, there must be something else. There has to be something else. And that's when the search begins. So how do we do it? There's a number of ways we can do it. But we have to remember, in the Pravrajika Upanishad, it says, not for the sake of the husband or the wife or the child or my job or whatever, that the other person is loved, appreciated, etc. It's for the sake of the self within them, the divine within them. However, in the initial stages, in the stage that we're in, it's for our own egocentric satisfaction or our own security or etc. That's why we form relationships, that's why we love other people, etc. But as we go on expanding our sense of self, then we begin to see that same all-pervasive self in others. But remember, everything depends on our perception. You cannot maintain your own individuality and say everything is Brahman, Brahma Satyam Jagan Mithya. That's wonderful. But what actually happens is Brahman is Mithya and the Jagat is Satyam. So the world is real and Brahman's unreal, right? I mean, that's pretty much what we feel. But that's not the truth. So we can proclaim that, and we should remember it, of course, it's the truth. But then where our behavior and our sadhana and everything should be in accord with that. That is how we make this real transformation. What we believe in our heart, what we speak, and what we do, we have to be integrated. Personality has to integrate. It's tremendous tapas to grow in spiritual life. And the impetus has to be, before we actually discuss some practical ways of trying to do this, the impetus has to be a tremendous yearning. Sri Ramakrishna is so practical in the gospel. He said, there's only 2 things needed. Do you know those 2 things? Anybody? Sincerity and yearning, right? Yeah. And we think, that's not a problem. Easy. It's not that easy. People shed bucketfuls of tears, he said. Her husband, wife, job. We fall apart over these things. Who cares for God? Who cries for God? Why? Because that reality is not real to us. That brings me back to my original point. If we live in a disconnect in our spiritual life, it's very difficult to make progress and go forward. So we have to be honest with ourselves, because this is a subject tonight of discussing self. And where am I? We're all in different stages of evolution, different rungs of the ladder. We need inspiration. We need all of those things. But we also need a realistic assessment of where we are. The teachers help us find that. And when we see where we are, this is what happened to Arjuna. And that was the realistic assessment that he got from Sri Krishna. Get up. You're behaving like a coward. But Sri Krishna had great love for Arjuna. He was a beloved disciple. But he had to shock him out of this delusion. And of course, the whole 2nd chapter discusses the nature of the Atman. You can't wet it, you can't burn it, you can't kill it, etc., etc. So our teachers help us find where we are. So we have to have, I'm not saying that we have to go into an in-depth psychological analysis of ourselves. That's not necessary. But we need to have a realistic assessment of where we are, what our goal is. Sometimes if you question yourself. I'm not talking about questioning others. Question yourself, what is my quest? What am I expecting out of this? Who is God? What is myself? We have to think about these things. Not just read about them, philosophize about them. Think about it. And you think, my God, if it's true that I really have this spiritual dimension to my being, and it's reachable, who's not going to do everything possible to reach that, to get to a state where it's absolute freedom, absolute bliss, joy, never changing, no sorrow, no pain. This is what the masters are saying. It's a beautiful treasure, and you have it right in your heart. But it's covered. So that's one of the first steps, is we have to have this intense yearning, this sincerity. If we have that yearning and sincerity, we're halfway there. But the yearning is something that has to be cultivated. It's not, for some people it comes naturally. Maybe they've gone through various experiences in previous lives or this life or whatever, but they're very earnest about it. But for most of us, it waxes and wanes at times. And if we look closely and we see, why does it wax and wane? And then we realize, to some extent, it's a matter of our interest. If our interest is tied up in this world and trying to achieve something permanent in this world, then it's going to be hard to give the whole of your mind to a spiritual pursuit. Now, that's not to say everybody has to renounce the world and become a monk or a nun or go to a cave. No, that's not the point. The point is we have to live in this relative world. We have to do our duties. We have to do our job. All of that we should do and more. This is the whole subject of how to make regular work, karma, yoga. It's a path to enlightenment. But all of these other things we need to consider. How important is it to me? Is it really important? You know, things are quite important to us, right? If I say to you, oh, well, food's not that important. Well, just don't eat for 3 days. And then what happens? You know what happens. Or don't sleep. Like Sri Ramakrishna, remain sleepless for a week or a month. What's going to happen? So we have to attend to things. We are psychophysical beings, one level of our being. So let us remember that always, that we're multidimensional beings. And this is the only instrument that we have. We can't jump out of ourselves to reach our true identity. So that's why they say in Sanskrit that the body is the first instrument in the practice of sadhana. So we accept these things, but this is not our final resting place. I was telling the Narwalas when they picked me up from the airport, I love airports. I don't go very often, but it's a fascinating study. You know, you stand there and people are rushing, they're going this way and they're going that way, and nobody's in a permanent, where's the permanence there? There's no permanence. They pick up this bag and they're going this way and out this way and over that way, and I'm thinking, where's everybody going? Why are they in such a rush? Maybe they're rushing to meditate, I don't know. But the point is, we're constantly moving, and we have these identities, and we can't deny that. So that's my point about saying we have to see where we are. We can't just suddenly say, oh, okay, I'm not going to have any expectations for my work. I'm going to renounce this and that. It doesn't work that way. Our practice has to be in accord with our temperament. It has to resonate with our inner mood and our own growth. We can't walk in somebody else's shoes. So we have to figure out where we are, and we should be sincere with ourselves. That's a big help. So now, because our identity is so entrenched for all these reasons that we've been talking about, we have to introduce some ideas that will help us loosen this identity. And so how do we do it? the actual process, the yoga, let us say, of transmuting the small self to an expanded sense of self. As I said before, we're not dealing with two selves, two separate consciousness or awareness. Consciousness and awareness is one. Because of this big mistake, we bifurcate consciousness and we see the duality. You know, the Upanishad says wherever there's duality, the Chandogya Upanishad, there's fear. Why? Because we get insecure. When actually there isn't an other. So we have to heal this bifurcation. And the bifurcation's in the mind. It's not in truth. Truth is truth. Nothing happens to the truth. So we have to take this instrument of the body and the mind and work with it through sadhana, through meditation, through various spiritual practices. Why? We should have a very clear idea in our mind. Why? Why am I doing this? Because somebody said so? Because everybody else is doing it? It's popular? Those can't be the reasons. The reason has to be a real soul search within. Let me try to find, I'm told by these ancient rishis and seers that this is the truth. God, it's marvelous. It's just wonderful. Why is it wonderful? Number one, we can never die. It's the truth. We're immortal. Nothing can happen to that. And you think about that, it's just simply temporarily covered, but it's accessible. But I have to do something to assess that truth. Now let me see, what can I do? So we can say, for the yoga part, it's twofold, I would say. So there's an internal aspect, there's an external aspect. Now the internal aspect is basically a shift of attitude. As I said, your own identity, your own concept of yourself is a mental concept. Mental. What is mind? It's a vibration. So look at these things deeply. You have to think about it deeply. What is it really? And when you penetrate like that and ask questions like that, the truth slowly starts to open up, starts to reveal itself. And we get little glimpses or insights just in our common everyday experience. It happens. It can happen, does happen, will happen. But we have to challenge ourselves. That's the point. We have to challenge ourselves. So in the shift of identity, what I mean by that is, in the relative world, everything is associated with something else. We don't need Einstein to tell us that. He can give us the theory, E = mc squared. He can give us the theory. And he was right. Everything's relative. So everything is dependent upon something else. And everything that we know or experience is associated with something else. That's the nature of relativity. The nature of spiritual reality is that it's an absolute reality. It's unconditioned, uncaused, it's unrelated, it's not limited, etc. So it's not that this other self is existing somewhere outside of ourselves in the sense of an external, in heaven or some external place. I mean, heaven and hell, it's all in your own mind. We don't need a lot of conviction for that. When we go through difficulties or problems, it's hell, is it not? That hell exists in your own mind. It doesn't exist in some physical place, except maybe in the Puranas. I think they have quite a few hells. And I'm not saying they're not true. So the shift of identity is very important. So that sounds rather schizophrenic, I suppose. But what it really means is that we have to associate ourselves with something spiritual. And Swami Vivekananda very brilliantly having analyzed the human condition and human nature, of course, developed the 4 yogas for different temperaments. So what I'm suggesting is that when we shift our identity away from Jane Smith, since she's our example, she still remains Jane Smith, relatively speaking. But in her sadhana, she shifts her identity. How do we do that? Any number of ways we can do that. You know, by temperament, some people maybe are devotional by temperament. Even if they don't really accept, a personal God, Saguna Brahman in Vedanta, as most of you know, doesn't necessarily mean a person. It can be an embodiment of qualities. It can also be expressed through a person, like a Jesus or a Buddha or Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, etc. So if we identify with one of these illumined souls, these spiritual masters, with a particular attitude, I'm a child of God, I'm Holy Mother's daughter, Sri Ramakrishna is my friend, like this. Because the Hindus have figured it out that they take very practical approaches to this switch from humanist to divine. We take the human relationships, what we know in our everyday life, and we try to spiritualize those. We can't just say, okay, I'm leaving my wife or I'm leaving my husband. I'm not going to pay attention. No, in and through these, people have become great knowers of God, illumined souls, by performing their duty, by living their lives as we all live our lives. But what's different about it? Their attitude is different. Their perception is different. It's like the Buddhists say, after illumination, what? The laundry. Before illumination, the laundry. Nothing's different. It's the same laundry. But you do it with an illumined mind. So let us remember that we're talking here in terms of transformation of our mental attitude. Now, spiritual dimension's a different level, but to get to that spiritual dimension, we have to use the instrument of our minds. If our minds are all tied up in all of these identities, we cannot free it enough to perceive that other level of reality. So that's the first thing, is shifting the identity. So that's one way. We develop some sort of a relationship. A woman went to Sri Ramakrishna and she said, I can't meditate and I can't do this and I can't do that. And Sri Ramakrishna said, what's obstructing you? What's coming into your mind at the time of your meditation? And this woman said, I have to take care of my nephew. His mother died, something happened. And Sri Ramakrishna said, fine, but see Krishna, see Gopala in that nephew. Now that's coming from Sri Ramakrishna, but he gave her the instruction. He said, take full care of everything you're doing, continue to do, but think of him as the embodiment of Gopala. This woman attained a very high state. She simply took what was on hand in her life. She transformed it. So this is what the teachers are asking us to do. Some people may not resonate with a personal aspect. Maybe they're more jnanis going to the highest goal. That's fine. Those of a more intellectual temperament, we can say, or intellectual temperament, they prefer to discriminate. And perhaps in and through their relationships and their work, they will try to separate what is real, what is unreal, and so on. As I said in the beginning, at one level, there's no unreality, really. The us-sat exists within our minds. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense what Swami Vivekananda says. Open your eyes and see him. The divine is shining through every being. Every being is the embodiment, is divinity. Not just being, everything. So when that's the case, yes, we can discriminate. We can say asat, the unreal identity card. That's a mental concept. What is unreal? What is unreal? that which is changing, that which is perishable. Because unreal, sometimes if we don't really think about what we mean in Vedanta by asat. Sat in Vedanta means reality, existence. Asat, negative. What it means is there's a lack of awareness. That's all it means. Swami Pravrajika was a great Advaitin and a great Vedantin. And it's said when he was a young monk, he spent a lot of time in solitude, and he had memorized at a young age 8 of the Upanishads, etc., etc. He was a great scholar. And when he went to Sri Ramakrishna said to him, his name was Hari, pre-monastic name, and he said, Hari, tell me what your Vedanta says. Doesn't it say that God alone is real, and this world as we see it is unreal? Yes, Master. Then let go of the unreal and stick to the real. He gave up his philosophy books. It's the practice. That's it. It's the practice. We have to practice. We have to make it real in our life. So for some people, discriminating like this is more to their temperament. That's fine. But we have to remember, some people consider themselves an instrument. Karma yoga is not as easy as we may think. And Sri Krishna spends the whole of the 3rd and 4th chapter in detail describing what it means to live life as a yajna, as a sacrifice, and all of the preparations to really practice karma yoga, which involves the development of buddhi yoga, etc. It's not that easy. But we practice it as a practice. We practice karma yoga. Fine, I don't want to accept any personal God. Perhaps discriminating and thinking in that way doesn't appeal to me. I will simply do my work. I'll do it to the best of my capacity, and I won't expect any results from that, etc. So that's one attitude. As I said, it's not that easy. To work without the thought of all of our individual private investment and what goes into that work, to say that I'm completely detached from that, that's pretty difficult to do, because our work, all of these things that we identify, they're completely superglued to our identity. So you pull that away and say, I'm not going to expect these things, and our identity starts to fall apart. Of course, that's what we want on one level. We want to shift our identity. But that comes back to the point that we really have to have the yearning and sincerity to want to do this. Otherwise, we won't be motivated to take spiritual life seriously. So, letting go of our identity, performing work as a karma yoga, as a pure karma yoga for the sake of work, very difficult. Not impossible. Then we start. We go in stages. See, we go in stages. So we start, and we combine. That's what Swamiji wanted to see. Most of us are a combination of different qualities. Very rarely are you going to find somebody that's a pure bhakta, pure jnani. We have all sorts of facilities. And the intelligent thing is to turn all of those facilities toward the divine. But this is where being creative in spiritual life comes to play. We have to figure it out. What works for us? And then put it to practice in our life, not just listening to the ideas and then going home and, okay, over a cup of coffee, I'll mull this over. No, we have to mean it. We have to change our life accordingly. And when we take that step, then we start to see that real change starts to take place within us. So there are various attitudes that we can have that will help us in disidentifying ourselves with our identity as we know it now, as we've been discussing. But because this is a relative world and because of our nature, we have to identify with something. That's the point. So we have to identify with something spiritual. We need to identify with something to bring out all of the creativity within us for our evolution and so on. We can't just jump from A to Z. We have to evolve. And when we evolve thoughtfully and intelligently and mindfully, then we see that we can make great strides quickly. But what happens is we become a little half-hearted, or we start off and everything's great, and then something happens and, we slow down. And then we start up, and then we slow down. This is not anything that's obvious to anyone else. Just look within yourself. We have this great resolve. From tomorrow, I'm going to get up at 3:30 in the morning, and I'm going to meditate for 2 hours, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. So instead of taking these giant steps, we might say, okay, from tomorrow, I'm going to try to be regular, even if it's for 5 minutes. We have more than 5 minutes to eat, and we have more than 5 minutes to sleep. So don't we have 5 minutes for our spiritual practice? See, it should be that important to us. And Sarvapriyananda was a 15th century Acharya, and in Vedanta Sara, it's explained, it's a beautiful example. How should you approach a spiritual teacher? What should be your attitude towards your spiritual practice? You go like your hair is on fire. If your hair is on fire, do you stand and think, okay, well, let's see. How can I put this out? And I wonder if there's a faucet over there. Your head's gone by then. So you just rush to the nearest source of water and stick your head under the water. Buddha gives another example. He says, say somebody shoots you in the back with an arrow. Do you think, I wonder what caste he was. I wonder what kind of arrow he used. You go on like this. By the time you pull the arrow out, you're gone. So this is how urgent it should be for us. Like our hair is on fire. So just keep that image in your mind. Do I feel like that when I sit for meditation? My hair is on fire? So this is what I mean by intensity. So this internal shift really involves trying somehow, in your own creative way, to shift your identity. This is the beauty of Vedanta. Things aren't spelled out, A, B, C, D. It's put in a general kind of way, and we have to figure it out. I know one of the senior Swamis once said he went to a senior Swami, and the Swami had scolded him for something, and he said, well, why didn't you just tell me to do such and such? You could have just told me. And the senior Swami said to the Swami, you see, that's not how you learn. You have to use your buddhi. I cannot just tell you what to do. So most of you probably have had that experience. Your spiritual teacher will give you an outline. They will give you directions. They will certainly answer your questions. But to a large extent, this is a journey from the alone to the alone. And we have to figure it out. And the more you figure it out, the more you make it your own. So I'm just saying, shifting the identity, it can raise a lot of questions. But you have to see where you are in your life, what you're doing. I can't shift my identity in the way you do, or the way she does, or the way she does, or he does. It's not possible. So we have to figure that out. But just remember, that's one of the key things of making this, shall we say, bridge between ourself as we know ourself right now and opening up this expansion of self through the process of yoga. As I said in the beginning, the Gita is a yoga shastra. If you study it in that light, you will see that Krishna outlines practices for this. The interesting thing is, Sri Krishna does not give a systematic philosophy in the Bhagavad Gita. No, he does not give a systematic, you're not going to find it like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras where you have 1, 2, 3, 4 sutras and it's divided. Not like that. The teachings of the Gita are scattered. So it's a wonderful study to, for example, take the subject of karma yoga. You're going to find verses on karma yoga in almost every chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. or Jnana Yoga, Buddhi Yoga, things like that. So he comes here and there in his teachings. It's not going to be, okay, chapter 6, yes, generally it's designated as the chapter of meditation, true, or the chapter of knowledge, etc., etc. But Krishna's, these teachings are scattered throughout the Gita. So he doesn't focus on a systematic philosophy of work, per se. He gives us the principles of work and other practices. And we have to churn and find that. It's all there. But if you read the Gita like that, study the Gita chapter by chapter, you will see there's not a systematic organization of ideas. It's not that kind of a scripture. It's a yoga shastra. It's for practice. So we have to do something with our identity. So we either expand our identity, I think pretty soon we have to end. You give me the high sign.
We can go to Q&A.
Oh, Q&A, okay. So let me just make a few points and I'll stop. So we shift our identity in some way. We try to do that. And the second thing that I mentioned was in action. So, I mean, mostly our motive for action is wide-ranging. Why do we perform any action? Usually we do it because we get something out of it. And Sri Krishna himself says, even a fool won't do something unless he expects something. So we have to really understand what we mean by not expecting the fruits of action. You're a fool if you don't expect the fruit of action. I'm going to go, I'm going to perform my job, say in the financial district, and I don't expect a paycheck? No, that's not a proper interpretation of what Krishna is saying. These are subtle psychological things. No, in this realm, we do expect. We should expect. It's the realm of cause and effect. We have to live our lives. But we have to have this other concept in mind and what it means. That's what I'm saying. We can't take it for face value. We have to think about it. What does it mean? So externally, yes, normally we're motivated to action, but for so many reasons. Prestige, power, money, whatever. So nothing wrong in those things. The problem is we identify, again, with what we do. So there can be, like King Janaka, or there can be a millionaire that is, in theory, that is completely detached. One wonderful story that I love is, I'm very fond of George Washington Carver. I don't know if you all are familiar with him, but he was an African-American scientist, and he developed many uses of the peanut in the southern part of the United States. A marvelous man, a very spiritual man. And at one point, he didn't care about money or anything. He had his life savings in a bank, and the bank went bust. And his comment was, well, I'm glad somebody found the use for the money. I wasn't doing anything with it. I love that story. And he meant it. Okay, we're not all George Washington Carver, but that's an example. So it is possible to, even in and through all of the things, motivations for our actions, that if we can remain, as Krishna says, separate from the action, that action won't bind us. It's the identity. It's because we get all wrapped up in it. It's the identity with the action that causes the reaction. It's not the action. You see, the world isn't the problem. People aren't the problem. The problem is worldliness. The problem is selfishness. That's the problem. And that exists in our own heart and mind. So the problem isn't out there somewhere. The problem's here. So that's why we have to tackle it inside, outside, through the shift of identity, and in and through our actions, how we act. Krishna gives many, many instructions about how to perform action step by step without becoming attached to the action. So that's a struggle, and it's a sadhana, but that is what is required. And as I said before, it's not easy because our whole individuality, our whole self-identity is at stake here. So everything that we've spent our life building up around ourselves, we're about to sacrifice on the altar of self-restraint. Are we ready for that? You know, once some young boys were boasting to Swami Pravrajika, one of Sri Ramakrishna's disciples, give us divine love, because he was the embodiment of divine love, Swami Pravrajika, Thakur's disciple. And Swami Pravrajika became serious. He loved these boys. He became serious. He said, are you ready to pay the price? Then give me your head. That's the price. So we have to put it into practice, in action. We have to sacrifice, as I said, our ego on this altar of self-restraint. What does that mean? It means all of our spiritual practices. We have to have this strong motive for wanting to shift our self-awareness. I mean, one very strong motive is the pain that the first personal pronoun causes us. So much pain and suffering. It may not be physical pain, mental pain. That's one very good reason. The other reason, the most important reason I feel for spiritual seekers, is that they're longing to find real meaning in their lives. Something permanent, something substantial, something that will not disappear, something that is true, something that is, isn't that what we're all seeking? We all want to be happy. The most horrible crime is committed. Why? Basically, if you analyze it, all beings want to be happy. They want joy. There's probably something in their lives. I thought about this a lot after 9/11. Are they really to blame? You don't know what happens in a person's life. We don't know the karma. So many things happen in people's lives, so much pain and agony. Maybe they don't have the same opportunities that other people have. They're repressed for some reason. They become violent for various reasons. It's all misdirected search for happiness, for security, for joy. That's why you have noble people like Desmond Tutu in South Africa, truth and reconciliation, the most horrible crimes. No, we will forgive those people, honestly forgive those people. Why? Because you see the divine in that person. It's all misdirected. That's the point. So we try to redirect that energy and to see a broader picture. So then with that, I would say that this attitude helps us very much without changing our work, trying to spiritualize our work, remain unattached. This is one of the main ways that we can uproot this worldliness or selfishness within us. That's what Krishna is basically trying to get across to Arjuna. Arjuna thought he was being very compassionate. And as I said in the beginning, he had the most marvelous arguments. You can't read it closely, the first chapter. Every single argument that he puts forth, it's a perfect allegory for our life. It's very reasonable. It just wasn't based on truth. And it wasn't true for him. I mean, Sri Krishna knew very well if Arjuna had renounced, as he wanted to do, I don't want the blood of my forefathers, I don't want this responsibility, I'll just retire and become a bhikshu, I'll go to the forest. And Sri Krishna knew quite well if Arjuna went to the forest, what would he do? Is he going to sit quietly and meditate like a brahmana? No. Within a week, he'd be hunting deer and bear, and, this is what he would be doing because he was a kshatriya. That was his nature. So Sri Krishna is like, recognize your nature and become illumined through that. Don't deny your nature. Stand up. This is your duty. I have many interpretations of the Gita, but I like this idea because that's what Arjuna would have done. He could no more go and sit quietly in the forest and go to the moon. He was not qualified for that. And furthermore, it wasn't his dharma. which takes us to the concluding idea that, this is what swadharma, making work, ordinary work, into a yoga, that's what it's all about. It's trying to become perfect where we are, not where we aren't. We don't have to go out of ourselves to do something. No, however you are right at this moment, that's your base. And it's available to all of us. So I think with that, I will conclude. And just keep in mind that this work that's, even the word, when it's selfless or unselfishness, it says a lot. It's minus the self, right? Unselfish. Minus self. So if you have a mother, say, or a caregiver, ordinary circumstance, and that person is caring for a child or a patient, a nurse, at that moment, that person puts all of their vested self-interest on hold, and they give their full attention to that child or patient or person that needs help. That is the way to karma yoga. And we forget ourselves. Swami Vivekananda said, the best work I've ever done in my life is when I was totally without thought of self. So I have no self-consideration there. I'm totally absorbed. And so however you wish to think of that, some people wish to think I'm worshiping God in that form, like Sri Ramakrishna's woman that he told, serve your nephew, seeing him as Gopala. That's one way. There are many ways. But that's the point, is that we remove self from the equation. And there are various ways of explaining it. We can shrink the self. We can expand the self. There was Girish Ghosh, Sri Ramakrishna's Bohemian devotee, said the difference between Nag Mahashaya, the great householder disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, and Swami Vivekananda, he said the net of Maya could not hold either one. Nag Mahashaya became so small, so humble, he slipped through the net. And Swami Vivekananda expanded to such an extent, the net couldn't contain him. So, as I said, this is a mental state and exercise. So we can do this in many ways. We become small, the ego becomes small, we expand it to the infinite, like the Brihadaranyaka says, not for the sake of the self. We start for the sake of the self. Let us be clear. We're very selfish. Fine, we start there, but we expand it. And as we expand our awareness, and we become more and more in tune with that, then slowly we won't identify with this bundle as much as we did before. And we go a little bit further, and then we begin to feel, yes, there's something else within me. I'm not just what I thought I was. There is a spiritual dimension within my being. And we can experience that. It's full of light and joy. We go a little bit further, like the great masters say, and we actually perceive ourself pervading the whole universe and all beings. So that's really the goal of the yoga of self-awareness, is taking this small self and transmuting it into the universal self, to the big self. Thank you. Om Madhupatarthayate madhuksharanti sindhavaha madhvirna santoshadhihi madhunaktamutoshasi madhumatparthivagam rajaha madhutyoratna pita madhumano vanaspatir madhumagamastu suryaha madhvirgavo bhavantu naha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May the winds blow sweetly and the rivers carry sweetness to us. May the herbs and the trees be full of sweetness. May night and morning yield us joy. May the dust of the earth give us sweetness. May the skies scatter happiness. May the sun shower bliss. May the cows yield sweetness. Om, peace, peace. Peace be unto us all and to all beings everywhere.